Greetings, and welcome to Beatles Stuffology, where two old friends sit about and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is McQuarre, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm okay because I'm very excited because I have discovered something about Danish rock and or roll music this week. I have discovered that there is a Danish rock and or roll band called Miss Lizzy, and I never knew that. But by God, they're bland. Anyway, that was an interesting point to the week that came up in the old YouTube algorithm, as it were. So, yeah. Thank you, Beatles, for helping me to discover another band who play long, dull guitar solos.
Well, yes, on the subject of long, dull guitar solos, you've kind of blown the surprise of what episode we're talking about. Not that there's any surprise given there's a file name, but
I'd say that the guitar solo in today's song is dull, but not long. I mean, too long, sure, but yeah, anyway. Yes, so, Dizzy Miss Lizzy, although this song, the Miss is spelt with two S's. For the Danish band, it's spelt with two Z's.
Ah, good. Copyright neatly avoided, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I don't know if the estate of Larry Williams are particularly prone to lawsuits. But I mean,
almost as well to err on the side of caution with these things.
Well,
I think.
yeah, I mean, given he had his own potential legal troubles in his life for not being the nicest of people, yeah, well, maybe that would make them be a little bit more focused on getting some money. But I don't know how much of a legacy he left behind in terms of family. So anyway, we've reached the end of Help. Yes,
we have. Thank God for that.
Yeah, we have. And actually, this song forms an interesting little coda to the album because we're back on that kind of punchy, rocky end, a la Money and Twist and Shout. So it's got that kind of upbeat push at the end. Although it's probably worth saying that the album doesn't really need it.
No, I think that's quite the understatement. I mean, this isn't a good song that hasn't been recorded well for an album that doesn't need it, I think is how I would phrase it. It's just
hang on. Can we unpick that? Because there were a few. Yeah. There was some negatives. So this isn't a good. Right? Can you say it again? This isn't a good song.
And there isn't a good version of it.
Oh, right.
That isn't needed on the album.
That isn't needed. Okay, right. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Well, it's probably fair to say that it wasn't originally recorded for this album or with a view to this album. It's sort of recorded, I think, possibly whilst they were actually, away filming, because I think they were doing some recording in April, and they come back and they do some recording in the early summer. But this is recorded, this and another Larry Williams song, on one day in May, I think the 10th of May 1965, seemingly at the behest of Capitol Records, because their American record company had enough songs left over from mucking up their previous releases that they wanted something to put on this album. And although they will go and have this spurt of creativity over the coming weeks in order to get the second side of Help done, what we find here is that basically, if I could just be so bold, they can't be bothered, and therefore I know what we'll do. We'll play something that we know how to, and we've been in this territory before, haven't we?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So let's we need a track for the album. Let's play something we know how to play, or indeed, for an EP, and the Carl Perkins stuff, for example, might fall into that category on Beatles for Sale and the EPs around that time. So we end up with something that's for the American releases, which they weren't really that impressed by, that ends up then on Help because, it's another song and it just fills out the album. And it really does feel like it's a case of, something that they've picked on because it fills the gap. And do you think at this point, just to throw it back to you, that that this also then marks a stage in their career where that possibly for the last time they're going to do this gap filling, that they've become such serious artists and they're going to develop that artistry even more, that they're going to move on from filling a gap or indeed fixing a hole.
Hey, excellent work. Yes, and I think it's pretty unquestionable. The I'm going to have to use the P word. The perfunctory nature of this is just completely unavoidable. There's very little effort put in. There's very little attempt to do anything with it other than just knock it out and get it over and done with. And this is the last time we're going to be bumping up against, capital C classic rock and roll when we're talking about the Beatles. There may be a little bit when we get to the Get Back sessions, but for all that we have, had several songs on the albums and, live material as well, which have fallen into the category of sort of classic rock and roll. This is the last time anything is really going to make it onto an album. It's interesting, therefore, unintentionally, I think, but it's interesting, therefore, just how little effort is put into this, how much they just don't need this prop anymore. They've moved on, their albums have moved on, the writing has moved on, the performances have moved on. There's just no need for this, and that's kind of the aura that surrounds this version. It's kind of inescapable. And when we've come across like classic rock and roll songs before, we've been talking about stuff like Twist and Shout. Twist and Shout is a classic for a reason, but the reason isn't exclusively the Beatles. Sometimes we'll come across a little lost gem, like Boys, for example, which probably would be completely obscure were it not for the Beatles. Dizzy Miss Lizzy is kind of somewhere in between, I think. It's the Larry Williams version is fine. The Beatles version is not. But I think in the end, this probably just isn't a very good song. And it doesn't really feel like it's fulfilling any particular function in the album, which is fair enough because it wasn't really recorded for the album. It was just recorded for a product. And so as a result, it's this kind of weird sort of orphaned end to that part of their career. And certainly as far as album recordings are concerned, we're not going to miss it.
So if I could just pick you up on something, when you say it's classic rock and roll, are you using classic in the sense of, well known, or classic as in of a particular era?
Of a particular era.
Okay.
For sure,
Okay.
yeah, you're
Sort of
right.
like
Of course,
late-
they're not
late
the same
50s.
thing. Yeah, exactly. That late 50s explosion, which still animates the kind of music which is being produced in the early 60s, but that kind of, the coal has been taken out of the fire, as it were. That initial jag of energy has cooled down, but because bands like the Beatles were kind of worshipping at the altar of Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis and all these kind of people, there's still some kind of animating energy around that sort of material. And, 1958, this is exactly coming sort of towards the end of rock and roll's initial surge. So classic in small c chronological time rather than classic as in it's a great classic.
So I wonder if it then comes into that category of perhaps originally they played it because it's fun to play. I mean, it must be fun to play because it does have a stomp to it that can be quite powerful, but also then because maybe for some people it also shows a certain level of knowledge or cleverness, that look at us, we know songs by an artist that isn't as famous as these other ones, therefore we are more discerning and more knowledgeable about rock and roll than you. It's the expression that's sort of cropped up in the last 5 to 10 years. People talking about a deep cut, which is, I find particularly irritating because it's not like someone's hiding these songs away. But yeah, when you talk about the fact that you like an album track from a band's fifth release, apparently that might be a deep cut just because it wasn't bought by umpteen million people. No, it was put out there for public release. So maybe there is for some people that deep cut element to this. But it does sound like half a dozen other songs that could be out there, which is worth remembering. That rock and roll of this period wasn't necessarily completely unique that people were borrowing from each other. So, but it is fun. I mean, it is a fun song, and probably worth then mentioning the original, because the original is pretty different to, well, no, let me backtrack. The
Yeah.
original is both exactly the same and also pretty different to the Beatles version, or rather, the Beatles have taken on board a lot of what Larry Williams does in producing this. There's no, I know we've talked about this before, there's no major attempt at interpreting this song other than the fact that it's sped up a bit, Lennon screams a bit, and there's no brass.
I think the brass thing is the thing that's most telling about it, actually, because that the it's positively jaunty in the original recording, but it's got
Yeah,
that kind of bam ba-dum ba-dum ba-da. And McCartney is carrying that line on the bass, but as always, it's a bit muddy when it's on the Hofner. It's a bit buried in the mix. It doesn't have enough punch to really drive the song. And to be clear, I don't really think it would do if it was him playing the Rickenbacker rather than the Hofner either. It's just one of those things that it needs more. It needs the brass line, or it needs something to push it. And without it, it sounds exactly what it is. You know, a knackered band clubbering something out because they haven't really been given much option. And that's I mean, everything about this recording just sounds absolutely knackered. And the absence of anything like the brass that's on the original does means it's got nowhere to go. It turns up, does its thing for 2.5 minutes, and then buggers off at the absolute fag end of an album that doesn't require it. And the absence of that extra instrumentation is just kind of, I mean, maybe it's not fair to compare it to the original, but oh well, we're going to do it anyway. But it shows the lack of care, the lack of interest, the absolutely. I need to find a different synonym for perfunctory, but that nature of the song.
yeah. I think it's hard not to compare, bearing in mind how little they've thought about changing it. Which again may be part of the early days of rock and pop, that you play a song that you like because you want to show your influences and to show how clever you are, how knowledgeable you are, rather than providing some sort of brand new musical interpretation. That's just the nature of things. Um, but there are some differences beyond the lack of brass that do make a difference. So the guitar, I think, is quite telling for me, that you have on the original, the guitar line is used much more sparingly. That yes, you have it in the intro, yes, you have it between the verses, but then during the verses, it's the brass that makes things tick. Whereas George, with the exception of one section, is playing that goddamn riff all the way through. No, it's the same riff, but it doesn't irritate me on the original. But the sound that they're using on the Beatles version, it's tinny.
Yeah, it's so weedy and weak.
Yeah, and it's a shame. And you sort of think, well, someone of George's talent could have come up with something that would have been more effective if perhaps they had been that bothered. Now, the funny thing is that it doesn't make it bad overall, because actually John's screamed vocals work, because it gives it the kind of energy that's lacking from, I feel anyway, from the instrumentation. So there's he's got enough of a shouty vocal here, a cleanish shouty vocal as well, which doesn't sound like it's swabbed in whatever effects were available at the time. It actually sounds like it's him belting it out. That really doesn't completely make up for, but helps to compensate for the lack of interest in the instrumentation.
Yeah, and I'm not particularly taken with Lennon's vocal. This is clearly an attempt to do Twist and Shout Mark II. And whilst it's also fine, it's also never really any better than that. It's quite interesting to compare and contrast it actually to the version on Live Peace in Toronto in 1969. There's two things which are really different about that. One is the guitar riff. Is I don't know for a fact that it's played in a Les Paul, but it sounds like it is. It's a big, chunky, kind of fat sound. It almost sounds like the guitar is kind of playing itself, and it gives a nice big beefy kind of sound, which works really well in that kind of live context. It's a fairly ragged version. It's not what you would say finely crafted musicianship, but it gets its point across. That slower vocal is a little bit more successful. I don't think you would say it was more restrained, but it's a more successful version overall, because I think there's something fairly sort of desperate about Lennon's vocal on the Beatles version, and not in a good way. That slight sense of desperation, if you can just scream that little bit louder, or just manage to get, the needle into the red a little bit more, then maybe the kind of, that sort of animating energy from Twist and Shout will somehow be transferred across to this song, and it isn't. It's just kind of a bit flat and desperate, and it doesn't really work. But it takes very little change for it to become successful, which is why that kind of Live Piece in Toronto version is kind of interesting to listen to.
Sometimes louder does not equal better, and
100%.
There are certainly some vocalists who believe that if they're giving it their all, then they're proper singers. And I was reminded of this. I've been listening to Suede's Dogman Star a little bit recently, just trying to work out if it's genius or turgid, or a turgid genius. And there's a live version of Still Life from that album, which is meant to be like this sweeping epic, on Jules Holland around the time the album came out. And Brett Anderson really goes for some of the vocals, and my God, it sounds awful. You think, well, actually, do you know, something more subtle, something more restrained could be incredibly affecting there and fit in with the song. You'd let everything else in the song build and get dramatic, but the vocal doesn't have to be. And that's where the drama of the song is much more effective, of Dizzy Miss Lizzy, is much more effective when Larry Williams is singing it, because he sings it. Now, I have stated in the past that I'm not a huge fan of a lot of Lennon's vocal efforts, certainly in the early part of the Beatles' recording career. I don't mind this. I think there are times when he's a better screamer than McCartney. There are times when McCartney is a better screamer than Lennon. They can both do it affectingly, but at least they're relatively restrained in terms of how often they do it. So that's quite useful. But I'd go Larry Williams over Lennon on this, definitely, because of that slower, more restrained, almost, should we say, heartfelt, if it's possibly heartfelt with these lyrics, attempt at this. But it's difficult to be mean, because it is a song from the early days of rock and roll. It's short, it's sharp, it gets out of there relatively quickly, although I do find that the end of the Beatles version is relatively sudden and very anticlimactic.
it's
Whereas
the sound of four people giving up.
Well, and actually, therefore, on that, it's worth mentioning that George seems to give up part the way through, after about
just
a
loses the will
half.
to live.
Well, after the solo, and I think it must have been a pretty awful solo for him to play if he's just really playing that riff and a minor variation on that riff over and over and over again. But around about a minute 30, he just seems to stop playing for about 15 seconds. Maybe he was in fits of giggles, or maybe he'd sort of just decided, I've had enough now. Oh God, I've lost the will to play. But it goes awry there. I'm gonna choose to believe that he was just having a giggle at that point, and then got himself together, and then got back on with it. So we'll at least fit in with the theory that they did it because it was a fun thing to do. They had some fun. They got it recorded, and maybe there was also a sense of, can't believe we're getting paid for this.
Well, I think that would certainly be fair enough. There is on the vocal front. I'm sorry to have to mention this, but I'm going to anyway. We do frequently talk about cover versions on the podcast, and there is a cover version from 2011 by, who would have guessed it, Shakin' Stevens, which is materially better than anything on the Beatles version. It's really weird. It's from some live album. And I promise you, I didn't specifically set out to find some Shakin' Stevens content for this podcast, but now that we've got it, it's there, and it's quite a good vocal. Curiously, it's one that reinstates the brass section, and once again, the song just feels much better for having it there. But it's kind of interesting to hear even now when sort of comparatively contemporary versions are getting knocked out. They're going back to the original template. They're not going back to this.
Well, now that you've mentioned that, I'm tempted to try and find out whether or not Shiwaddy Waddy also did a version.
I mean, it seems like the sort of thing that they would have done.
Oh, I know, but I really want to know which is. Oh, yeah. So certainly YouTube has a clip of them playing it live at the Belfast Opera House in 1990. So yeah, I mean that fits. That fits, yeah. Doesn't it? There you go. Yeah. By the way, I do like from time to time looking up at the comments on pages about songs about Beatles Bible, because actually what you tend to find is that there are some people who will defend any old rubbish. But actually,
are you implying that this is any old rubbish, Andrew?
Well, not really. I mean, but I don't think I've been mean about this song at all. And at least I've tried to sort of justify the whole kind of maybe they were having fun thing. But the comments under the fairly perfunctory information they've got about the song on there, I think one person tries to claim it's absolutely fantastic. Pretty much everybody else is like, yeah, this is a bit, yeah. But then maybe that exists. Maybe that's in keeping with what some people think of the American releases in general. But hey, we shouldn't necessarily get too stuck into that, because we're living in a period where there's a lot of Beatles content. And we're recording this in the week that the documentary about the American tour of 1964's come out. The week after, the Capitol box set re-releases. I mean, I'm pretty sure that Sean has probably released another of his dad's albums at this point, costing £1,500 for 3 extra remixes and some new processes. I think Living in the Material World's just been remastered and re-released as well.
Yeah, it's just had its 50th.
Super Macca's on tour at the moment, and there was there not a drama about Brian Epstein's life that came out quite recently as well?
I don't know if has it been out or is it still to come out? I haven't really kept track of it, but yeah, it's around this time.
Being the world's worst Beatles fan, I'm not, I haven't delved into any of this stuff.
Nobody's listening to this expecting research. It's okay.
Well, no, I wouldn't necessarily call it research.
Awareness.
But there's a lot. There is a lot of Beatles content out there, and there's more to come over the next few years. It will just keep coming. So there's clearly a market for it, or they're trying to develop that market. But I remain unconvinced about whether there's a market for the US Capitol releases box set. I just don't see how they're going to make a massive amount of money out of that.
No, but there'll be wealthy fans with more money than sense that'll probably lay out for them, I suppose.
There you go. You've just insulted probably 3 people who listened. So if you've bought it, you're wealthy and you have more money. Mind you, if you're wealthy and you have more money than sense, you've still got quite a lot of sense because you've got a lot of money.
Well, it depends what the ratio between the two is, I suppose.
Well, okay. So maybe if you're not wealthy and you've bought it. Anyway, 4 out of 10.
4 out of 10. Thank you. That was the question that was coming next. I think we've clearly run out of material. I think that you like this song more than I do, so I will give it 3.5.
Not that much more then.
No, well, you did also use the word perfunctory without prompting, so
Oh, did I?
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
It's catchy.
Right. Yeah, clearly. Yeah, perfunctory-itis.
Indeed. Right, lovely. We will leave it there. Unless you have anything else you want to add before we do the socials.
No.
Good. We've ended this podcast almost exactly the same way that this song ends, with a kind of shrug.
I'm much more interested in the fact that a cat is doing weird things at the moment. There's a storm blowing outside, and she's just going nuts in here, discovering parts of this room that she's not investigated in the 2.5 years we've lived here. And now she can't work out how to unlock the maze. Anyway.
Right, okay, I think if we've got to the point where we're talking about cats, it's time to wrap things up. You can really get a hold of us. You can contact us by email. We are BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We're on what's left of Twitter @Beatles_ology. And we are Beatles Stuffology on Instagram. You can also find my blog at www.jgmcquarrie.scot, where I write about film and music and TV and just anything that really happens to catch my interest. You can... no, you can't. This is going so badly. Please like... This will be fun to edit. Please like, rate, and review us. You may not want to after this, but go on, give it a shout anyway, on whatever podcatcher you are using, so that more people can find the show. Now, here we have a small moment of tension, because we didn't decide what we were going to talk about next before we started this recording. So
there's no tension. There's no
Andrew
tension.
has
You
generously said,
coming.
whatever I announce is what we're doing next. So either we're going to talk about the album next, or we're going to talk about the movie next.
Or we do both in one.
No, we're not going to do both in
save
one.
Our listeners time.
No. We're sticking to the format, come hell or high water. Next episode, we are going to talk about...
the weather. Or the government.
The movie. I've decided that's what we're doing next. But until then, please keep listening.